This is the story of an invasion, an incomprehensible act of violence that shattered the illusion of safety in a place built specifically for peace. This is the Keddie cabin murders, a crime so brutal and baffling that it has haunted investigators, journalists, and a small, quiet community in the mountains of California for decades. We are in the early spring of 1981, in the remote and rugged landscape of Plumas County, Northern California. Our focus is the Keddie Resort, a cluster of simple, inexpensive cabins nestled deep within the vast expanse of the Plumas National Forest. Near the shores of Lake Almanor, Keddie was never glamorous. It was a rustic refuge for those seeking solitude, affordability, or a quiet escape from a harsh world. In April of that year, the resort was sparsely populated, perhaps 30 residents in total. This isolation, meant to be a comfort, became a deadly liability. The Sharp family had moved into cabin 28 during the winter of 1980. Sue Sharp, a resilient mother of 36, sought a fresh start for herself and her children, hoping to leave a difficult, sometimes violent past behind. Cabin 28 was a small, two-bedroom dwelling with a simple, open-plan living area. Sue lived there with 4 of her children: John, 15, Sheila, 14, Ricky, 10, and Greg, 5. Her 12-year-old daughter, Tina, was often with them. To the Sharp family, this humble cabin was a fortress, a place where they could finally feel safe. The night of Saturday, April 11th, 1981, was Easter weekend, unremarkable in every way. John Sharp and his best friend, Dana Wingate, 17, were at the cabin. The 2 teenagers had spent the day together, and records would later indicate they had been seen hitchhiking near Quincy, a town approximately 30 miles away from Keddie, suggesting they were returning home after an excursion. This small detail, the hitchhiking, would become a persistent but frustrating clue about the events preceding the attack. In the small southwestern bedroom of Cabin 28, the youngest children were settled for the night. Ricky Sharp, Greg Sharp, and Ricky's friend, Justin Smart, who was also 10. Sheila Sharp slept in the same room. The main activity that evening was centered in the larger, eastern bedroom and the living room, where Sue, John, Dana, and Tina were believed to have been. As the cold spring night descended upon the Sierras, the cabin was sealed up against the chill. And that is perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the tragedy. Whatever happened inside Cabin 28, whatever cataclysm of rage and brutality unfolded, it occurred in profound silence. No neighbors reported screams. No one reported loud disturbances. The attack was either executed with terrifying speed, or the victims were silenced instantly. Around 7:30 on Sunday morning, Easter Day, Sheila Sharp awoke. She was the first to emerge from the western bedroom. As she walked into the living area, she immediately sensed that something was terribly wrong. The front door was ajar, letting in the cold mountain air. The large television set was on, emitting a meaningless buzz, but it was the sight in the living room that stopped her. The rug near the entrance had been pulled aside, suggesting a violent struggle had taken place. As she looked further into the room, Sheila was met with a scene that remains one of the most horrific ever documented in Californian history. The small living room had become a slaughterhouse. Sue Sharp was on the floor, bound tightly with both medical adhesive tape and electrical wire. Her throat had been severely slashed. Lying near her, both John Sharp and Dana Wingate were similarly bound. The level of brutality was unimaginable, delivered with the multiple weapons, a large knife and a heavy, blunt instrument, likely a hammer. The violence was clearly personal, overwhelming, and utterly merciless. The fact that the 3 victims were tied with both medical adhesive tape and electrical wiring was critical. This was not merely an attempt to restrain them, but a calculated, deliberate act of torture and degradation. Both teenagers had fought fiercely, based on the defensive wounds found on their bodies. John Sharp sustained multiple stab wounds, while Dana Wingate was brutally struck with the blunt object, fracturing his skull. They were completely overpowered by the attacker, or attackers, in a frenzied explosion of sustained violence. In the western bedroom, the 3 young boys, Ricky, Greg, and Justin, were found unharmed, asleep in their beds. This detail defies all logic. The horrific violence had occurred just feet away, yet the children slept through it all. Did the killer not know they were there? Or did the sheer frenzy of the attack cease before the children were awakened? This inexplicable preservation of the youngest witnesses remains a haunting, unanswered question. Sheila fled to a neighbor's cabin, and the alarm was raised. When law enforcement finally arrived, they were confronted with a scene that was both immediately overwhelming and deeply confusing. And critically, a piece of the puzzle was missing. The initial police response was immediately complicated by 2 factors: the sheer barbarity of the crime scene and the remote location, which necessitated coordination between multiple small agencies. The investigators documented the shocking state of the cabin. Blood spatter covered the walls, the furniture was overturned, and the curtains had been drawn, indicating a deliberate attempt by the perpetrator to conceal the actions inside from the outside world. The struggle had been intense and prolonged. Investigators quickly cataloged the weapons used. A large kitchen knife was found, along with evidence suggesting the presence of a heavy claw hammer or similar tool. Another knife, found bent beneath Sue Sharp's pillow, suggested that one of the victims, likely Sue, had attempted to defend herself before being quickly overpowered. The crime was clearly multifaceted, utilizing at least 2 distinct types of implements. Beyond the bodies, other small details were noted. A bottle of alcohol was found near the bodies, along with a roll of medical tape, a critical item that must have been brought to the scene, as it was not readily available inside the cabin. An unopened can of Budweiser sat chillingly on a table, suggesting that the event may have begun as a social interaction before escalating violently. However, the immediate focus was dominated by the unsettling observation. Tina Sharp, the 12-year-old daughter, was missing. Her body was not among the dead, and the back door of the cabin was standing open. Speculation immediately centered on abduction. Had she escaped during the attack? Or, more sinisterly, had the perpetrator taken her? The investigation was instantly fractured, forced to manage 3 homicides while simultaneously launching a massive search for a missing child. And here, the systemic failures began. The Plumas County Sheriff's Office was a small agency, completely unequipped to handle a mass murder of this complexity and savagery. The initial preservation of the crime scene was severely inadequate. In the chaos of the early morning, first responders, medical personnel, and officers not directly involved in the evidence collection were allowed to enter and contaminate the scene. Crucial footprint evidence that could have been preserved in the melting spring snow or mud outside the cabin was overlooked entirely. The handling of the critical binding materials was another catastrophic error. The medical tape and electrical wiring used to secure the victims should have been immediately treated as prime sources of DNA and fingerprints. Instead, these items were mishandled during early forensic analysis, effectively destroying their value as unassailable evidence. The early leads were conflicting and confusing. Because the children in the back room were unharmed, investigators initially struggled to link the crime to a random intruder. The focus remained tightly on people known to the family or residents of the small resort. One of the first theories explored was a potential drug deal gone wrong, given Dana Wingate's age and the transient nature of some of the resort's residents. Another theory centered on a domestic dispute or an act of revenge, specifically targeting Sue Sharp, given the intense personal nature of the violence. The sheer brutality of the attack seemed to suggest deep, personal rage. The most disturbing aspect was the disappearance of Tina. For 3 years, she remained a missing person, a haunting symbol of the case's incompleteness. Police followed countless dead-end leads, searching for her across state lines, convinced she might have been trafficked or held captive. The silence surrounding her fate was deafening. Then, in April 1984, the silence broke. A man searching for deer antlers in the rugged terrain near Feather Falls in Butte County, approximately 100 miles south of Keddie, stumbled upon a gruesome discovery. He found a partial human skull and a few skeletal bones. Forensic analysis confirmed the remains belonged to Tina Sharp. The discovery of Tina's bones, so far from Keddie, immediately changed the entire scope of the investigation. The location of the remains indicated that the killer had not only committed the murders, but had taken the chilling, calculated risk of transporting the body a vast distance to a different county. This suggested the killer had access to a vehicle and had a degree of composure in the hours following the massacre. Found alongside Tina's remains was a piece of the electrical wire used to bind her. This physical link was crucial, solidifying the connection between the Keddie cabin and the remote disposal site. Tina Sharp had been murdered that night, or shortly thereafter, and her disappearance had been part of the perpetrator's cover-up strategy. The focus shifted from an act of random rage to a planned, cold-blooded execution and disposal. The investigation into the Keddie murders devolved into a maze of fragmented jurisdictions and poor communication. The Plumas County Sheriff's Office was overwhelmed. The lack of standardized protocols meant that different agencies involved, the FBI, the State Attorney General's office, and local police, often worked at cross purposes, undermining any unified investigative effort. This investigative chaos allowed key pieces of evidence to be lost, ignored, or contaminated. One of the greatest losses involved trace evidence. Early reports suggested the presence of at least 2 different blood types belonging to the perpetrators, neither matching the victims. This evidence, which could have immediately identified one or more attackers, was reportedly misplaced or degraded during the initial, chaotic stages of analysis and was never definitively confirmed or used. Another devastating oversight involved the processing of the crime scene photographs and notes. Investigators failed to systematically document and photograph potential footprints or tire tracks that could have survived in the mud and snow outside the cabin. The killer's ingress and egress were never firmly established through physical evidence, leaving the timeline and the number of intruders based primarily on conjecture and later witness statements. The psychological dimension of the crime further complicated matters. The combination of intense, personal rage suggested by the knives and the clinical, calculated restraint indicated by the bindings and the remote disposal of Tina's body presented a confusing portrait of the perpetrator. Was it one person in a frenzy, or 2 people, one brutal, the other composed? The most critical witnesses were the surviving children, particularly Justin Smart, the 10-year-old friend who was asleep in the cabin. The accounts of the children were crucial but also difficult to interpret, filtered through the trauma and suggestibility of young minds. Years later, Justin would recall a highly disturbing encounter he had in the cabin shortly before falling asleep. He claimed to have seen a man in the cabin with a long beard and glasses, possibly an acquaintance of the family, talking to Sue Sharp. Justin's account would evolve and change over time, making it difficult for investigators to rely on it, but it kept the focus firmly on local residents. Another persistent detail was the possibility of a hitchhiker. Given that John and Dana were seen hitchhiking near Quincy, some theorized that they had brought the killer, or killers, back to the resort with them. This introduced the unnerving possibility that the victims had invited their own destruction. However, the personalized nature of the violence strongly suggested that Sue Sharp herself was the primary target, not a random act of a traveling psychopath. The years following 1981 were marked by a lack of progress. The case went cold. The files grew dusty. The resort of Keddie, its reputation shattered, became a place of tragic infamy, its residents unwilling or unable to speak about the terrible secret that Cabin 28 held. The Plumas County Sheriff's Office eventually closed the active phase of the investigation. It seemed the Keddie cabin murders would become just another unsolvable case, defined by its brutality and the initial investigative failures. But the coldness of the case could not extinguish the resolve of a few dedicated individuals who believed the truth was still buried beneath the errors of the past. The focus had to shift away from generalized theories and toward the specific individuals who had occupied the shadows of Keddie. In the mid-2000s, renewed attention, driven largely by the advent of cold case analysis and the determination of a few retired investigators, brought the focus sharply back to two individuals living just across the road from Cabin 28, Martin Smart and his friend, John Baubed. Martin Smart was the father of the young boy, Justin Smart, who had slept through the murders. Martin lived in Cabin 26, directly opposite the Sharp family. He was known in the community to be volatile, prone to fits of rage, and had a documented history of domestic violence. Crucially, Martin was known to have had an increasingly antagonistic relationship with Sue Sharp. John Bubede was a transient friend of Martin's who was staying with him at Cabin 26 at the time of the murders. Bubede was a far darker character, with an established criminal record and rumored connections to organized crime figures in the Chicago area. The combination of Martin's local rage and Bubede's hardened criminal background presented a terrifying partnership. The prevailing theory suggested that Martin Smart and John Baubed entered Cabin 28 that night, possibly under the pretense of a social visit or an argument with Sue Sharp. The situation escalated rapidly. John Sharp and Dana Wingate, acting defensively, intervened to protect Sue. This act of resistance likely triggered the brutal, multi-weapon attack, fueled by Martin's local resentment and Bubede's cold capacity for violence. The circumstantial evidence against this pair became overwhelming decades later. First, there was the highly disturbing communication from Martin Smart. Shortly after the murders, Martin sent a letter to his estranged wife, expressing a chilling sense of closure. In the letter, he included a cryptic, menacing line suggesting that he had achieved revenge and was now free. Investigators who reviewed the letter years later believed this strongly implicated Martin in the death of Sue Sharp. Second, the hammer, a heavy claw hammer, consistent with the type of blunt force trauma inflicted on the victims, was found discarded in a pond near the Keddie Resort years after the crime. While the hammer could not be conclusively tied to the crime, Its discovery near Martin's residence added a disturbing piece to the puzzle. Finally, and most definitively, came the DNA. A renewed forensic examination in the 2010s focused on the discarded pieces of the amedical adhesive tape used to bind the victims. Miraculously, viable male DNA was recovered from the tape. This DNA did not match any of the victims or the initial persons of interest. It represented an actual piece of the perpetrator. Unfortunately for the pursuit of justice, both prime suspects were beyond the reach of the law. John Bubede died in Chicago in 1988, and Martin Smart died in 2000. Both passed away before the modern DNA evidence could be fully processed or linked definitively to them. The long failure of the investigation allowed them to escape legal scrutiny during their lifetimes. The strong suspicion remains, but the official confirmation and prosecution were forever denied. The Keddie cabin murders, despite the overwhelming circumstantial evidence pointing to the Smart-Bubede theory, officially remains an unsolved case. The bureaucratic errors, the lost evidence, and the passage of time created an impenetrable shield for the perpetrators. The physical site of the tragedy was finally erased from existence. After standing vacant and haunted for over 2 decades, Cabin 28 was finally demolished in 2004, a final act of removal that some found comforting and others found deeply disturbing. It eliminated the final physical link to the crime, leaving behind only an empty patch of ground in the forest. The key to potentially closing the case hinges entirely on the DNA evidence recovered from the medical tape. Investigators today are working diligently to try and match this male DNA profile to the genetic records of the deceased suspects or their relatives. A definitive match would provide the unassailable proof necessary to name the perpetrators, even in death. However, the case still contains layers of complexity that defy simple answers. Early witness testimony suggested the possibility of 2 distinct blood types belonging to the assailants, hinting at a potential third person involved that remains entirely unknown. Furthermore, the question of why the younger children were left untouched, or why Tina's body was transported 100 miles, adds layers of calculation that make the crime difficult to fit into a simple profile of spontaneous rage. The Keddie cabin murders serve as a chilling case study in the devastating consequences of initial investigative failure. The chaos of that Easter Sunday morning, the failure to secure the evidence, and the rivalry between law enforcement agencies allowed the cold to settle on the truth. Today, the victims, Sue Sharp, John Sharp, Dana Wingate, and Tina Sharp, remain figures of a historical tragedy, their memory preserved primarily by dedicated true crime researchers and a small group of determined cold case investigators. The community of Keddie itself has struggled for decades to shed the terrifying reputation thrust upon it. The long shadow of Cabin 28 persists, not in the ground where the cabin once stood, but in the official police files, and in the enduring commitment to find a conclusive genetic match. The search continues, determined to finally confirm the names of the individuals responsible for the unholy savagery that occurred in the quiet mountains of Northern California in 1981.